Midnight Train, Chapter 1, A Stormy Departure. The howl of the wind rattled the windows of the station as Gideon Drake stood on the platform, coat drawn tight against the biting November chill. Above him, the sign read, Edinburgh Waverley, its letters faintly illuminated by a flickering overhead light. The Caledonian Sleeper train stretched before him, its carriages gleaming with an air of vintage charm that contrasted starkly with the modern station around it. At 67, Gideon wasn't sure if he had the patience for a journey like this. The days of covert missions and high-stakes interrogations were behind him, replaced by a quieter life in his London flat. But his daughter's persistent invitations had finally worn him down. A weekend in Sevenoaks, Kent, seemed a welcome escape from the monotony of his post-retirement life. The train's whistle pierced the night, drawing Gideon's attention back to the present. He adjusted his grip on his leather bag and stepped aboard. Inside, the warm glow of lamps cast long shadows on the walls, and the faint scent of polished wood and worn upholstery filled the air. As he navigated the narrow corridor to his cabin, Gideon couldn't help but notice the mix of passengers settling in. In the corner of the lounge car sat a wiry man with close-cropped hair and a nervous demeanor. His movements were jittery, his eyes darting around as though expecting someone to confront him. The freshly pressed suit he wore seemed out of place, as though borrowed for the occasion. Gideon pegged him as a man with secrets, though he filed the observation away for later. A few seats down, a middle-aged woman flipped through a dog-eared copy of The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. Her glasses perched on the tip of her nose, and she tapped a pencil against her lip, deep in thought. Gideon caught a glimpse of her notebook, filled with neatly handwritten notes in what looked like multiple languages. Vivienne, she introduced herself when she caught his glance. History teacher, you? Gideon Drake, he replied. Visiting family. Her polite smile seemed genuine, but something about her watchful eyes struck him as unusual. Further down the car, he passed a uniformed train guard checking tickets. Gavin, his name tag read. The young man greeted passengers with a practiced cheeriness, though the wariness behind his smile suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Finally, in the dining car, a man in a thick wool sweater stood behind the counter, chatting amiably with another passenger. His accent, heavy and Bulgarian, added a touch of foreign charm to his words. The name embroidered on his sweater read, Manuel. Reaching his cabin, Gideon placed his bag on the neatly made bunk and sank into the armchair by the window. Outside, rain lashed against the glass, distorting the glow of the platform lights as the train lurched into motion. He leaned back, letting the rhythmic clatter of the train lull his restless thoughts. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of peace. It didn't last. A sudden knock at his door snapped him upright. Sliding it open, he found Gavin, the guard, standing in the corridor. Apologies for disturbing you, sir, Gavin said, his voice low. Just wanted to make sure everything's in order. We've got a storm rolling in, so there might be some disruptions. I'm fine, thank you, Gideon replied, studying the young man's face. But even as Gavin left, Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that the disruption had already begun. Chapter 2. The First Vanishing. The storm intensified as the train rattled southward. Rain pounded against the windows, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the countryside, fleeting glimpses of barren fields and skeletal trees. Inside, the warm glow of the vintage carriages and the gentle sway of the train should have been comforting. But for Gideon, something felt off. He couldn't pinpoint what it was. Perhaps the nervousness in Gavin's voice, or the way Vivienne had studied him just a little too long before returning to her book. Gideon had learned to trust his instincts over decades of investigative work, and tonight they were screaming at him to stay alert. After an hour of watching the countryside blur by, Gideon rose from his seat, deciding a walk through the train might settle his unease. The lounge car was busier than before. Vivienne was still buried in her book, though now she seemed to be watching the other passengers over the rim of her glasses. Manuel was tending to a small group in the dining car, his cheerful laughter carrying over the clinking of glasses. The nervous man in the suit had moved to a corner table, his hands clasped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. Gideon leaned against the bar, his military-honed habit of observing people kicking in. It was a skill he hadn't lost, even in retirement. The hum of conversation filled the air, polite exchanges between strangers, the occasional burst of laughter, but beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of tension. "Anything for you, sir?" Manuel asked, pulling Gideon from his thoughts. "Just water, thanks," Gideon replied. As the shopkeeper poured his drink, the train jolted violently, throwing everyone off balance. A woman yelped as her glass tipped over, spilling red wine across the table. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the car was plunged into near darkness. "Storm's worse than I thought," Manuel muttered, steadying himself. The lights returned, and the passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Gideon's hand instinctively went to the edge of the bar to steady himself, his mind racing. "Probably just a loose branch on the track," Gavin announced as he entered the car, attempting to reassure the passengers. But Gideon noticed something strange. The nervous man in the suit was no longer in his seat. His tea sat untouched, still steaming. "Where'd he go?" Gideon asked aloud. Vivian looked up. "Who?" "The man who was sitting there." Her brow furrowed. "I don't recall anyone sitting there." Manuel shook his head as well. "Not that I've seen." Gideon frowned. He was certain the man had been there, but now it seemed as though no one else had noticed him, or perhaps they didn't want to admit they had. Rising from the bar, Gideon moved to the door at the far end of the car. It opened with a metallic groan, revealing the narrow connection to the next carriage. The wind howled through the gap as he stepped across to the sleeper cabins. The corridor was empty, eerily silent compared to the lively chatter of the lounge car. He checked each cabin door as he passed. Most were locked, and faint sounds of sleeping passengers came from within. Others were empty, their beds neatly made. When he reached the end of the car, he found a crumpled piece of paper wedged into the doorframe. Unfolding it, he read the words written in a jagged hand. It didn't have to be this way. The words sent a chill down his spine. Turning the paper over, he found nothing else. No name, no explanation. But it was enough to confirm what he'd suspected since the storm began. Something was very wrong on this train. Gideon pocketed the note and made his way back to the lounge car. By the time he returned, the passengers seemed to have settled down again, but the nervous energy lingered. Vivian caught his eye as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Not yet," Gideon replied. But deep down, he knew the answer wasn't far off, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find it. Chapter 3. A growing tension. Gideon couldn't shake the message scrawled on the crumpled note. It didn't have to be this way. The words looped in his mind as he paced the lounge car. The nervous man's sudden disappearance, the oblivious reactions of the other passengers. It didn't add up. Back in his military days, a cryptic message like this would have been a clue to unravel, a piece of a larger puzzle. But this wasn't a covert operation or a battlefield. This was a train ride meant for leisure, and yet the stakes felt just as high. "Storm getting to you?" Vivienne's voice cut through his thoughts. She had closed her book and was watching him with sharp eyes. "Something like that," Gideon replied, sliding into the seat across from her. She tilted her head, her tone shifting to one of curiosity. "You seem different from the usual passengers. A man of purpose." He smiled faintly. "Retired. Purpose is harder to come by these days." Vivian nodded but didn't press further. Instead, she leaned forward. "Did you really see someone sitting there earlier?" Gideon paused. "You don't believe me?" "It's not that," she said quickly. "It's just strange. One moment you say he's there, and the next he's gone. No one else seems to have noticed him. That doesn't seem odd to you?" "It does," Gideon admitted. "But I've learned that oddities are often worth investigating." Before Vivian could respond, Gavin entered the car again, his uniform slightly rumpled. He looked more frazzled than before, his professional demeanor starting to crack. "Sorry to interrupt," Gavin began, addressing the passengers, "but we seem to have lost a bit of communication with the other train crew. Nothing to worry about," he added quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just a technical issue. I'll keep you updated." As he turned to leave, Gideon stopped him. "What kind of technical issue?" Gavin hesitated, glancing around at the other passengers. "It's the storm, playing havoc with the systems. Radio's intermittent, but like I said, nothing to worry about." Gideon nodded, but caught the flicker of unease in the young guard's eyes. Whatever was happening, it was more than just a technical issue. Once Gavin had left, Gideon turned back to Vivienne. "What's your theory?" "Me?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "You're observant. You've been watching the others since we left Edinburgh." Vivienne smirked. "You caught me. Occupational hazard, I suppose. People are more interesting than books sometimes." And, her expression grew serious, "the man you mentioned, if he was there and if he's gone now, then the question isn't just where he went, it's why no one remembers him." Before Gideon could respond, the train lurched again. This time, the jolt was harder, throwing passengers against their seats. The lights flickered once more, and the sound of rain seemed to grow louder, more insistent. The chatter in the lounge car died down as the passengers exchanged nervous glances. Gideon's instincts kicked in. He rose to his feet, steadying himself as the train swayed. "I'm going to take another look around," he said to Vivienne. "Be careful," she replied, her voice low. Gideon made his way back to the sleeper cabins. The narrow corridor was dimly lit, the shadows stretching unnaturally long as the lights flickered. He stopped outside one cabin, noticing the door was ajar. Pushing it open, he found the room empty, but it wasn't just unoccupied. The bed was unmade, the blankets and pillows scattered, as if someone had left in a hurry. On the nightstand was another note, identical to the first. It didn't have to be this way. A cold knot formed in Gideon's stomach. He was about to leave when he noticed something else, a faint smear on the floor, leading toward the door. Kneeling down, he touched it with his fingers. It was sticky and dark. Blood. The sound of footsteps behind him made him whirl around. Vivienne stood in the doorway, her face pale. "I thought you might need backup," she said, though her voice wavered. Her gaze dropped to the smear on the floor. "What is that?" Gideon rose to his feet. "A clue," he said grimly, "and not a good one." Chapter 4. Lines of Deception. Vivienne's hands tightened on the doorframe as she stared at the bloodstain on the floor. The storm outside growled like an animal, each gust of wind rattling the windows as though demanding to be let in. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Gideon pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his fingers clean, his thoughts racing. His years of investigative work had trained him to compartmentalize panic, to focus on the facts at hand. "First, we don't tell anyone," he said firmly. Vivienne blinked. "Why not? Think about it. We've already got passengers on edge. If they find out someone's missing and there's blood, it'll be chaos. Panic clouds judgment. We need clarity." Vivienne nodded slowly. "So what's next?" Gideon straightened. "I need to speak to Gavin. He's the only one with access to all parts of the train. Maybe he's noticed something we haven't." They left the cabin, and Gideon shut the door behind them, trying to suppress the image of the crumpled bed and the blood stain. The corridor felt tighter than before, the walls closer, as if the train itself were watching. When they reached the dining car, it was quieter than before. Most passengers had retreated to their cabins, and the ones who remained sat in subdued silence, their expressions wary. Manuel was clearing plates from a table, his usual jovial demeanor replaced with something more somber. He glanced up as Gideon and Vivienne entered. "Strange night," he muttered. "Storm makes people act funny, doesn't it?" "Funny how?" Gideon asked. Manuel hesitated, as if weighing whether to speak. "Some passengers, I don't know. They look at me like they've seen me before, but I've never met them." He shrugged, forcing a smile. "Probably my imagination." Gideon exchanged a glance with Vivienne but said nothing. They found Gavin at the far end of the car, leaning against the wall with a clipboard in hand. He looked up as they approached, his face drawn and tired. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Not exactly," Gideon said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I need to know if you've noticed anything unusual tonight." Gavin frowned. "Aside from the storm, passengers are restless, but that's normal in weather like this." "What about the man in the suit, thin, nervous? He was in the lounge earlier, but disappeared." Gavin shook his head. "I've been through the carriages twice. If he's not in his cabin, he's probably in the bathroom or stepping between cars for some air. People do that sometimes." "He's not in his cabin," Gideon said, "and he's not in the lounge or dining car. Are you sure you haven't seen him?" Gavin hesitated, his expression hardening. "Look, I've got enough to deal with without wild theories. I can't keep track of every passenger on this train." Before Gideon could press further, a loud clang echoed through the car, followed by a sudden sharp screech of brakes. The train jolted, sending plates and glasses crashing to the floor. Passengers shouted in alarm as the lights flickered once more, plunging the car into brief darkness before they steadied. "What the hell was that?" Vivian asked, gripping the edge of the nearest table. Gavin grabbed the intercom on the wall and spoke hurriedly into it. "Driver, come in. What's going on?" The speaker crackled, but there was no response. Gavin tried again. "Driver, respond." Still nothing. Gideon's chest tightened. "Where's the engine room?" Gavin stared at him. "It's at the front, but—" "Then we're going there," Gideon said, already moving. Vivian hesitated. "Shouldn't we stay put? What if something happens?" "Something already is happening," Gideon said sharply. "Stay here if you want, but I'm finding out what it is." Vivian glanced at the nervous passengers and back to Gideon. With a resigned sigh, she followed him. The journey to the engine room was a battle against the storm. The wind seemed to have found its way inside, howling through the gaps between carriages. The train swayed violently, forcing them to grab onto railings to keep their balance. When they reached the door to the engine room, Gideon tried the handle. It was locked. "Gavin!" he shouted over the noise. The guard, who had reluctantly followed, stepped forward and pulled a keyring from his pocket. "This isn't protocol," he muttered as he unlocked the door. Inside, the small space was eerily quiet, the storm muffled by the thick walls. The control panels glowed faintly, their dials and switches untouched, but the driver's seat was empty. "What the—" Gavin began, his voice trailing off. On the console lay another note, identical to the ones before. Gideon picked it up and read the words aloud. It didn't have to be this way. The three of them stood in silence, the weight of the mystery pressing down on them like the storm outside. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Storm. The storm outside clawed at the train like a restless beast, battering the windows and amplifying the uneasy silence in the engine room. Gideon stared at the empty driver's seat, the note in his hand feeling heavier than paper should. "Where's the driver?" Vivian asked, her voice sharp with fear. Gavin stepped forward, his usual cheerfulness replaced by a grim determination. "He was here before we left Edinburgh. I checked in with him during boarding." "Well, he's not here now," Gideon said, scanning the small space for any signs of a struggle. Everything was in place, no overturned chairs, no scuffs on the floor. It was as though the driver had simply vanished into thin air. Gavin reached for the controls, his hand trembling. "I don't know how to operate this thing. If we lose power—" "We're still moving," Gideon interrupted. "The train's running fine for now. Focus on the facts." But the facts were thin, an empty seat, a cryptic note, and now the unsettling realization that no one was in control of the train. "Gavin," Gideon said, turning to the young guard, "how many crew members are on board?" "Just me and the driver," Gavin admitted. "Budget cuts." Gideon swore under his breath. 2 crew members for an entire train? It was a recipe for disaster, and now they were living it. Vivian crossed her arms, her fear hardening into frustration. "This doesn't make sense. A man disappears from the lounge, the driver's gone, and all we have are these damn notes. What's happening here?" Gideon didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the note, its scrawled message taunting him. It didn't have to be this way. The words weren't just a warning, they felt like an accusation. "We need to search the train," he said finally. "Cabin by cabin, car by car. Someone knows what's going on, and we're going to find them." Gavin hesitated. "And what do we tell the passengers?" "Nothing," Gideon said. "The last thing we need is a panic." Vivian nodded reluctantly. "He's right. If people start freaking out, we'll lose any chance of keeping this under control." Together, the three of them left the engine room and headed back into the train. The corridor felt narrower now, the flickering lights casting strange shadows on the walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows made Gideon's skin prickle. The first car they searched was empty, its cabins untouched. The second car was much the same, save for a few passengers who were fast asleep, oblivious to the growing nightmare around them. It wasn't until they reached the third car that they found something new. One of the cabin doors was wide open, the light inside flickering weakly. Gideon stepped in first, his instincts on high alert. The room was disheveled, blankets tossed on the floor, a suitcase overturned. But what caught his attention was the smell. Burnt metal. "What is that?" Vivian asked, stepping in behind him. Gideon didn't answer. He crouched down and ran his hand over the floor. It was warm to the touch, as though something had seared the surface. In the corner of the room, a small, circular scorch mark marred the carpet. "Looks like someone burned something," Gavin said, leaning over Gideon's shoulder. "Or something," Gideon muttered, his mind racing. He'd seen similar marks during his military investigations, places where high-energy devices had been used. But this didn't make sense. What kind of device could leave a mark like that and vanish without a trace? Vivienne pointed to the nightstand. Another note sat there, identical to the others. "It didn't have to be this way." "That's 4 now," she said. "What do they mean?" "I don't know," Gideon admitted, "but someone wants us to figure it out." Gavin's voice trembled. What if it's not someone? What if it's something?" Vivienne shot him a glare. "Don't start with that supernatural nonsense. There's a logical explanation for all this." "Is there?" Gavin countered. "Because I'm not seeing it." "Enough," Gideon snapped. "We don't have time for theories. We stick to the facts." The train jolted again, harder this time, throwing them all off balance. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, Gideon thought he saw a figure at the far end of the corridor, a shadowy outline that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "Did you see that?" Vivienne whispered, her voice barely audible. Gideon nodded, his jaw tight. "Stay close." They moved cautiously down the corridor, the storm outside roaring louder than ever. The train felt alive now, its groans and creaks merging with the howling wind to create an almost human wail. When they reached the end of the car, they found the door to the next one locked. Gavin fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he tried to find the right one. "Hurry up," Vivienne urged, glancing nervously behind them. "I'm trying," Gavin snapped, finally unlocking the door. The moment it opened, a blast of cold air hit them, carrying with it the smell of rain and something else, something metallic and sharp. "Stay behind me," Gideon ordered, stepping into the next car. But as soon as he entered, he froze. The car was empty, completely empty. Not a single seat, no luggage racks, no passengers, just a long, dark corridor stretching into the storm. "What the hell?" Vivienne whispered. Gideon took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the shadows. "This isn't right." Before anyone could respond, the door behind them slammed shut, cutting off the faint light from the previous car, and then the train went silent. Chapter 6: A Corridor of Secrets. The sudden silence was deafening. The train's rhythmic clatter, the storm's relentless howl, even the faint hum of electricity, all gone. Gideon stood frozen, his senses on high alert. The darkness stretched before them, thick and impenetrable, like the shadows were alive and watching. Vivienne's sharp intake of breath broke the stillness. This doesn't make sense." "Stay calm," Gideon ordered, his voice low and steady. He reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt, a habit from years of carrying tools he might need in a pinch. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty corridor. It was wrong, all wrong. There were no doors, no seats, no windows. The walls were bare, the floor scuffed and uneven. This wasn't a passenger car. It was something else entirely. "Where are we?" Gavin whispered, his voice trembling. "We're still on the train," Gideon replied, though even he wasn't sure. "Stay close and keep quiet." They moved slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping across the corridor. The air felt colder here, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Gideon's stomach churn. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound stretching out like it didn't belong to him. About halfway down the corridor, Vivienne stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" Gideon paused, straining his ears. At first there was nothing, then faintly, a low hum. It wasn't mechanical, more like a vibration, pulsing through the air and into his bones. "It's coming from up ahead," Vivienne said, her voice barely above a whisper. Gideon nodded and pressed forward, his grip tightening on the flashlight. Every step felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening around them. At the end of the corridor, the walls opened into a larger space, a cavernous room that had no business being on a train. The flashlight revealed steel beams and pipes running along the ceiling, dripping with condensation. The floor was concrete, stained with dark patches that Gideon didn't want to examine too closely. In the center of the room stood a single chair. "What is this?" Gavin asked, his voice cracking. "Looks like an interrogation room," Vivienne said, her tone grim. Gideon's eyes narrowed. She was right. The setup was eerily similar to the makeshift rooms he'd seen during his time investigating military crimes. But why would such a space exist on a passenger train? As they stepped closer, the hum grew louder, resonating in Gideon's chest. He moved the flashlight over the chair and froze. On the seat lay a small, rectangular device, its surface smooth and black, with a single red light blinking at its center. "What is that?" Vivienne asked, stepping closer. "Don't touch it," Gideon warned, extending an arm to stop her. The red light blinked faster as they approached, the hum rising in pitch. Gideon crouched to get a better look, his mind racing. It wasn't a bomb, at least not any kind he recognized, but it was definitely some kind of technology, advanced and out of place. Suddenly, the light turned solid and a distorted voice filled the room. It didn't have to be this way. The three of them jumped, Gavin letting out a yelp. The voice was mechanical, emotionless, but the words were the same as the notes. "What the hell is going on?" Gavin stammered, backing away. Gideon didn't answer. He was focused on the device, on the voice, on the sense that they were being watched. The voice spoke again, louder this time. "You were warned." "Warned about what?" Vivienne demanded, stepping forward despite Gideon's protests. The device emitted a high-pitched whine, and the room seemed to shudder. Gideon grabbed Vivienne and pulled her back just as the light on the device blinked out. The hum stopped, plunging the room into an eerie silence once more. And then the shadows shifted. "What was that?" Gavin asked, his voice barely audible. Gideon turned his flashlight toward the walls, but there was nothing there. No movement, no figures, just the faint outline of pipes and beams. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice firm. They hurried back toward the corridor, but as they reached the entrance, the door slammed shut in front of them. Gideon tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Now what?" Vivienne asked, panic creeping into her voice. "Calm down," Gideon said, though his own heart was pounding. He shone the flashlight back toward the room, looking for another exit. That's when he saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the room, just barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. "Do you see that?" Gideon whispered. Vivienne and Gavin turned, their eyes widening. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. As it entered the beam of the flashlight, Gideon's breath caught. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow, dark and featureless, its edges shifting like smoke. The voice returned, low and menacing. "This is your last chance." Before Gideon could react, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into total darkness. Chapter 7. A Light in the Dark. The darkness was absolute. Gideon's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to hear any sound, any movement in the void. The storm outside seemed a distant memory now, swallowed by the oppressive silence inside the room. "Gideon?" Vivienne's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. "I'm here," he said, reaching out blindly. His fingers brushed against her arm, and she gripped his hand tightly. "Stay close, Gavin." Gavin's voice cracked. "I'm here." The room felt like it was closing in, the air thick and stifling. Gideon fumbled for the flashlight, tapping it against his palm in the hope of reigniting its beam. It flickered weakly, casting faint, erratic light that only deepened the shadows. The figure was gone. "Where did it go?" Vivienne asked, her eyes darting around the dim room. "I don't know," Gideon admitted, "but we're not staying to find out." The door to the corridor was still sealed, its handle immovable. Gideon scanned the walls, searching for another exit, another way out of this nightmare. That's when he noticed a faint glimmer on the far side of the room, a small panel embedded in the wall, its edges glowing faintly blue. "Over there," he said, pulling Vivienne and Gavin with him. The panel was sleek and featureless, save for a single square button at its center. The glow was steady, casting an otherworldly light that painted their faces in cold hues. "What is this?" Gavin asked, staring at the panel like it might bite him. "Technology," Gideon said grimly, "but nothing I've ever seen before." Vivienne leaned closer. "Do you think it controls the door?" "Only one way to find out," Gideon said. He pressed the button. The room shuddered violently, and for a moment, Gideon thought they'd made a terrible mistake. The blue light intensified, filling the space with a blinding radiance. Then, as suddenly as it started, the shaking stopped, and the light dimmed. The door to the corridor slid open with a hiss. go," Gideon barked, pushing Vivienne and Gavin through the opening. They stumbled back into the corridor, the familiar clatter of the train returning like a lifeline. The storm's howl filled the air once more, a strange comfort after the suffocating silence of the room. "Where the hell were we?" Gavin asked, his face pale. "Not somewhere we were meant to be," Gideon said, scanning the corridor for any sign of danger. Vivienne leaned against the wall, her breathing ragged. "This is insane. None of this makes sense. That room, the shadow, the notes, what does it all mean?" "I don't know yet," Gideon admitted, "but someone or something wants us to understand." They moved cautiously through the train, the flickering lights and groaning walls taking on an almost sinister quality. The other passengers seemed unaware of what had happened, most of them still asleep or quietly murmuring in their cabins. But as they passed through the lounge car, something stopped Gideon in his tracks. The man in the suit was back. He was seated at the same table as before, his hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea. His expression was blank, his eyes staring straight ahead as though he hadn't noticed their presence. "That's him," Gideon said, his voice low. Vivienne followed his gaze and froze. How is he back?" "Stay here," Gideon ordered, stepping toward the man. The man didn't react as Gideon approached. Up close, his face looked pale, almost waxy, as if he were a mannequin brought to life. "Where have you been?" Gideon asked, his voice firm. The man blinked slowly, his lips parting as though he were about to speak. But instead of words, a thin stream of blood trickled from his mouth. He slumped forward, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. "Gideon!" Vivienne cried, rushing to his side. Gideon felt for a pulse but found nothing. The man was cold, his body stiff as though he'd been dead for hours. "What's happening?" Gavin asked, his voice shaking. Gideon straightened, his jaw clenched. "We're running out of time." On the table next to the man's lifeless hand was another note. It didn't have to be this way. Chapter 8. The Passenger's Secret. The train rattled on, its rhythm at odds with the chaos unfolding inside. Gideon stared at the lifeless man slumped over the table, his mind racing. The blood pooling beneath the man's head glinted under the dim light, stark against the polished surface. "We need to move him," Vivienne said, glancing around the lounge car. "If the other passengers see this—" "They won't," Gideon interrupted, his voice tight. "We'll handle this quietly." Gavin was frozen in place, his eyes wide with shock. "He was gone. I swear he was gone." "He was," Gideon said, his tone steady but sharp. "And now he's back. We'll figure out how, but first we need answers." Gideon searched the man's pockets, careful to avoid the blood stains spreading across his suit. He found a wallet, a folded piece of paper, and a set of keys. The wallet identified him as Edward Lane, a name that meant nothing to Gideon. "What's on the paper?" Vivienne asked, standing guard at the door. Gideon unfolded it carefully. The writing was faint, as if scribbled in haste, but it was legible. "They're watching. Don't trust anyone. It's already too late." Vivienne leaned over his shoulder, her face pale. "Who's watching? What's too late?" Gideon shook his head, his grip tightening on the note. "I don't know, but Edward here knew something, and now he's dead." "We should go to the authorities," Gavin said, his voice shaking. Gideon shot him a sharp look. "And tell them what? That passengers are disappearing and reappearing dead? That there's a secret room with strange technology? They'll think we've lost it." Vivienne nodded in reluctant agreement. "He's right. We're on our own for now." Gideon pocketed the note and turned back to Edward's body. "We need to move him to an empty cabin, somewhere out of sight." They carried the man's lifeless body to an unused cabin in the sleeper car, working quickly and silently. Once he was laid on the bunk, Gideon locked the door and pocketed the key. "What now?" Vivienne asked as they stepped back into the corridor. "We find out what he knew," Gideon said. "Someone on this train is involved, and we're going to figure out who." As they made their way back to the lounge car, the atmosphere on the train seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. Gideon's instincts told him they were running out of time. In the lounge car, the remaining passengers were still seated, oblivious to what had happened. Manuel was behind the counter, wiping glasses with a practiced calm. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Quiet tonight," he said, his accent thick. "Too quiet," Gideon muttered, taking a seat at the bar. Manuel raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Vivienne slid onto the stool next to Gideon. "What's the plan?" "We watch," Gideon said. And we wait. Someone here knows more than they're letting on. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on each passenger. Vivienne, with her sharp mind and quick observations, was proving to be a valuable ally. Gavin, though rattled, seemed trustworthy, for now. Manuel's calm demeanor was suspicious, but there was no evidence to link him to the disappearances. And then there were the others. A woman in a tailored suit sat near the window, tapping on her phone. An older man with a scruffy beard sipped from a flask, his eyes half closed. A teenager with headphones bobbed his head to music only he could hear. Any one of them could be hiding something. As Gideon watched, the train jolted again, sending ripples of unease through the passengers. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment Gideon thought he saw movement outside the window, a flash of something dark and fleeting, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Did you see that?" Vivienne whispered, her eyes wide. Gideon nodded, his jaw tightening. "Stay here, I'm going to check it out." He stepped into the corridor, the faint hum of the train filling the silence. The storm outside was relentless, rain lashing against the windows. But something else was out there. He could feel it. Reaching the door to the next car, Gideon paused. His reflection in the window stared back at him, distorted by the rain. But there was something behind him, something darker than the shadows. He spun around, but the corridor was empty. "Gideon?" Vivienne's voice called softly from the lounge car. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet, and he had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. Chapter 9. Fractured Trust. The storm's fury battered the train, rattling windows and shaking the carriages as though the world outside were trying to force its way in. Gideon returned to the lounge car, his mind heavy with unanswered questions. Vivienne's concerned eyes met his as he stepped through the doorway. "Anything?" she asked, her voice low. "Nothing," Gideon replied, shaking his head. "But I felt something. We're being watched." Vivienne nodded grimly. "I've been watching the others. No one's made a move, but that doesn't mean they're innocent." Manuel wiped the counter with deliberate slowness, his gaze darting occasionally toward the other passengers. The teenage boy with headphones still bobbed his head to an invisible beat. The older man with the scruffy beard stared blankly at the ceiling, his flask dangling loosely in his hand. The woman in the tailored suit tapped her phone methodically, her lips pressed into a thin line. Gideon leaned closer to Vivienne. "Any of them could be involved, or none of them. We need more." "More what?" Vivienne asked, exasperation creeping into her tone. "Clues? Bodies? How far does this go before we find answers?" Before Gideon could respond, Gavin stumbled into the lounge car, his face pale. "There's another one," he stammered. Gideon rose immediately. "Where?" "The sleeper car," Gavin said, his voice shaking. "Cabin 12. Without waiting for Vivienne, Gideon marched toward the sleeper car, Gavin trailing behind. The corridor felt longer now, the flickering lights casting jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with every step. When they reached cabin 12, the door was ajar. Gideon pushed it open cautiously, his hand resting on the flashlight clipped to his belt. Inside, a woman sat slumped in the corner, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her eyes were open, staring vacantly at the ceiling, her mouth slightly agape. A trickle of blood ran from her nose, staining the collar of her blouse. Another note lay in her lap. It didn't have to be this way. Vivienne appeared behind them, her hand over her mouth. "Who is she?" Gavin stepped forward, swallowing hard. "Her name's Karen. She boarded in Edinburgh. I checked her ticket myself." Gideon crouched beside the body, searching for any sign of struggle, but like Edward Lane before her, there was none. The cause of death was a mystery, as was the chilling calmness of the scene. "She doesn't look scared," Vivienne said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's almost like she expected this." Gideon stood, his expression grim. 2 dead passengers, 2 notes, and still no answers. Gavin leaned against the doorframe, his breathing shallow. "What are we supposed to do? We can't stop the train. We can't call for help. Are we just supposed to wait for it to pick us off one by one?" "No one else is dying," Gideon said firmly. "Whatever's happening, we're going to stop it." Vivienne glanced at the note in Karen's lap. "These messages, they're meant for us. Someone wants us to understand something." "Or they're just playing games," Gavin muttered. Gideon turned to him. "If this is a game, it's a dangerous one. We need to find out who's behind it before it's too late." They left the cabin, locking the door behind them. The corridor seemed quieter now, the storm's roar muted, as though the train itself were holding its breath. Back in the lounge car, the atmosphere had shifted. The passengers were uneasy, their conversations reduced to murmurs. Manuel watched them from behind the counter, his expression unreadable. Gideon addressed the room. "Has anyone seen or heard anything unusual?" The passengers exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. "No one?" Gideon pressed. The woman in the tailored suit finally spoke, her voice clipped. "Unusual? You mean besides the storm, the flickering lights, and the general sense that something's horribly wrong? No, nothing unusual." Her sarcasm grated on Gideon, but he let it slide. "If anyone sees anything or anyone out of place, tell me immediately." "Who put you in charge?" The scruffy man with the flask muttered, his voice slurred. Gideon stepped closer to him. "Do you want to survive this?" The man shrugged and took another swig, but he said nothing more. Vivienne pulled Gideon aside, her voice low. "We need a new angle. Watching and waiting isn't getting us anywhere." "You're right," Gideon said, his mind racing. "We need to draw them out." "Draw who out?" "Whoever's behind this," Gideon said. "Whoever wants us to see these messages, to play their game." "And how do you plan to do that?" Vivienne asked. Gideon's gaze shifted to the passengers, his expression hardening. "By forcing their hand." Chapter 10. The Gambit. The lounge car had grown tense, the air thick with unspoken fear. Gideon stood at the center, his sharp gaze sweeping over the passengers. Each face bore a different shade of unease, some masked with bravado, others openly fearful. He needed a way to cut through the tension, to expose the truth hidden among them. "I'm going to say this one more time," Gideon began, his voice calm but firm. "Two people are dead. And this isn't random. Someone here knows what's going on, and it's time to come clean." The woman in the tailored suit folded her arms, her expression defiant. "What makes you think anyone here has answers? Maybe it's you. You seem awfully eager to play detective." Gideon stepped closer to her, his piercing eyes unyielding. "If I were behind this, you'd already be dead." The room fell silent, his words hanging heavy in the air. Vivienne broke the tension, stepping forward. "Listen to him. People are dying, and if we don't work together, more of us will follow." The teenager with headphones yanked them off, his face pale. "What do you mean dying? What happened?" "Two passengers disappeared and came back. Dead," Gavin said, his voice shaking. "And whoever's doing this left a note. It didn't have to be this way." The room erupted in murmurs, panic rippling through the group. Manuel cleared his throat loudly, silencing the noise. "So what do we do?" he asked, his calm voice carrying an edge of authority. "We set a trap," Gideon said, his voice steady. The scruffy man with the flask laughed bitterly. "A trap? What are you going to do, bait them with another passenger?" "That's exactly what I'm going to do," Gideon replied coldly, silencing the room again. Vivienne's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "It's the only way," Gideon said. "Whoever's behind this is watching us. They want us to react, to play their game. If we give them an opening, they might show themselves." Gavin shifted uncomfortably. "And what if it doesn't work? What if they kill someone else instead?" "They won't," Gideon said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Because I'll be waiting." The plan was simple but dangerous. Gideon would position himself as bait, isolating himself in one of the sleeper cabins. Meanwhile, Vivienne and Gavin would monitor the carriages from the lounge, keeping watch for any movement. The rest of the passengers were instructed to stay in their cabins and lock their doors. Not everyone agreed, but Gideon's no-nonsense demeanor left little room for argument. As the train rattled on, the storm outside seemed to grow fiercer, the wind howling like a warning. Gideon sat alone in the designated cabin, the door slightly ajar to tempt whoever or whatever was responsible for the disappearances. The room was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the train's engine the only sound. Gideon's flashlight sat on the table beside him, along with his leather-bound notebook. He tapped a pen against the cover, his mind sharp and focused despite the tension clawing at him. Minutes dragged into an hour. Gideon remained still, his ears straining for the faintest sound. The storm outside provided a steady drumbeat, but nothing else disturbed the oppressive silence. Then he heard it, a faint creak of floorboards just outside the cabin. Gideon's muscles tensed, his hand hovering over the flashlight. He listened intently, his heart pounding as the sound grew closer. Another creak, followed by a soft rustling. Someone or something was moving toward him. He gripped the flashlight, ready to spring into action. But before he could move, the door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. Gideon flipped the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the black. The cabin was empty. And then he saw it, a shadow moving along the wall, its shape shifting and unnatural. "Show yourself," Gideon barked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The shadow paused, its edges rippling like smoke. Then, without warning, it surged forward, slamming into Gideon with an invisible force that knocked him to the floor. He scrambled to his feet, the flashlight spinning wildly, its beam casting frantic patterns on the walls. The shadow was gone, but the oppressive sense of being watched remained. On the table where his notebook had been lay another note. "You were warned." Gideon's chest tightened as he picked up the note. The handwriting was identical to the others, jagged and hurried. The door burst open, and Vivienne and Gavin rushed in, their faces pale with fear. "We saw it," Vivienne said, her voice shaking. "In the corridor, a shadow. It wasn't human." "It was here," Gideon said, holding up the note. "What does it say?" Gavin asked. Gideon read it aloud. "You were warned." The three of them stood in silence, the storm raging outside as the train hurtled through the night. Chapter 11. A Step Ahead. The cabin felt colder now, the shadow's presence lingering like an icy breath on the back of Gideon's neck. Vivienne and Gavin stood frozen in the doorway, their faces pale under the flickering light. "We need to regroup," Gideon said, tucking the note into his pocket. "If we're dealing with something, or someone, that can move like that, we can't afford to split up anymore." "Where do we go?" Gavin asked, his voice trembling. "The lounge," Gideon replied. "It's central, and we'll have a clear view of anyone moving between cars." Vivienne nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "What's the plan, Gideon? You said we'd draw them out, but it feels like they're always a step ahead." "They are," Gideon admitted, his tone grim. "But this note, 'You were warned,' is different. It's not just a taunt, it's a shift in their message. They're escalating." As the three of them made their way back to the lounge car, the train jolted again, harder this time. The lights flickered, violently, and for a brief moment Gideon thought he saw the shadow darting along the wall ahead of them. When the lights stabilized, it was gone. "Did you see that?" Vivienne whispered. Gideon nodded, gripping his flashlight tighter. "Stay close." The lounge car was quieter than before. The passengers huddled in small groups, their murmurs filled with fear and confusion. Manuel stood behind the counter, his usual calm replaced by a nervous edge. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing you need to worry about," Gideon replied, his tone curt. "Everyone stays here until we figure this out." Manuel raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Instead, he began wiping down the counter, though his hands moved mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere. Gideon pulled Vivienne and Gavin into a corner, lowering his voice. "We're missing something. These notes, they're clues, but we're not putting the pieces together fast enough." "Maybe it's a message," Vivienne said, her brow furrowed. "Something we're supposed to figure out before it's too late." Gideon nodded. "The first note said, 'It didn't have to be this way.' That's a warning, but it's also a clue. Whoever wrote it believes this situation could have been avoided." "And the second?" Gavin asked. "They're watching. Don't trust anyone. It's already too late," Gideon recited. "That's paranoia. Or maybe it's a distraction. And the last one," Vivienne added. "You were warned. That feels final." "Exactly," Gideon said. "The escalation isn't just in the words. It's in their timing. The shadow, the notes, the disappearances. It's all building towards something." "What do we do?" Vivienne asked. "We flip the game," Gideon said. "We stop reacting and start forcing their hand." "How?" Gavin asked, his voice laced with doubt. Gideon's mind raced. The shadow's movements, the strange technology in the secret room, the scorch marks, all of it pointed to something more advanced than a simple killer or saboteur. There was a method to the madness, but they needed to find the core. The answer wasn't in the lounge or the cabins. It was in the train itself. "The engine room," Gideon said suddenly. "We need to go back there." Vivienne's eyes widened. "You think that's where they're hiding?" "No," Gideon said, his tone resolute. But it's where this started. The driver's disappearance, the train running itself. It's the only place that makes sense. What if it's a trap? Gavin asked. It probably is, Gideon replied. But we don't have a choice. The journey back to the engine room was tense, every creak of the train and gust of wind outside putting them on edge. The passengers watched as they left the lounge car, their eyes filled with questions no one dared to ask. When they reached the door to the engine room, Gideon hesitated. The last time they had been here, they'd found nothing but another cryptic note. This time, he was determined to uncover the truth. "Ready?" he asked, glancing at Vivienne and Gavin. Vivienne nodded, her jaw set. Gavin swallowed hard but gave a reluctant thumbs up. Gideon opened the door. The room was as they had left it, silent, the controls glowing faintly in the dim light. But something was different. The chair, once empty, now held a figure. "Driver?" Gavin whispered, stepping forward. "Stop!" Gideon ordered, his voice sharp. He moved the flashlight's beam over the figure. It was slumped forward, its face hidden by shadows. Gideon approached cautiously, his hand hovering near the figure's shoulder. With a quick motion, he turned it upright. It wasn't the driver. The figure was a mannequin, its features eerily lifelike. Its eyes were blank, its mouth frozen in a slight smile. In its lap was another note. "The answer lies in the light." Gideon stepped back, his mind racing. The light. What light? Vivienne pointed to the panel near the controls, its edges glowing faintly blue. That light. Gideon moved to the panel, his fingers brushing against its smooth surface. He pressed the button, and the room shuddered again, just as it had before. The blue light intensified, filling the space with an almost blinding glow. And then it happened. The room fell away. For a brief, dizzying moment, Gideon felt weightless, as though the train itself had disappeared. When the light dimmed, they were no longer in the engine room. They were standing in a long, metallic corridor, its walls lined with pulsating lights. The hum from earlier was louder now, resonating in their chests like a heartbeat. "What is this?" Vivienne whispered, her voice trembling. Gideon's eyes narrowed. This is where it begins. Chapter 12. The Hidden Path. The metallic corridor stretched into the distance, the pulsating lights casting shifting shadows on the walls. The hum that filled the air felt alive, vibrating through Gideon's chest like an ominous warning. Vivienne and Gavin stood close behind him, their breaths shallow in the cold, sterile air. "This isn't part of the train," Vivienne said, her voice trembling. "No," Gideon agreed, his eyes scanning the walls. "It's something else, but it's connected to the train. It has to be." Gavin rubbed his arms, his teeth chattering. "I don't like this. This isn't natural." "Keep it together," Gideon said, his tone firm. "We're here for a reason. We need to figure out what it is." The corridor was unnervingly silent, except for the steady hum and the faint whir of machinery somewhere in the distance. The walls seemed to ripple faintly as they walked, as if responding to their presence. Vivienne stopped suddenly, her hand shooting out to grab Gideon's arm. "Look." Ahead, a doorway slid open with a hiss, revealing a large chamber bathed in pale, bluish light. Inside, rows of consoles and screens blinked with incomprehensible symbols, their patterns shifting and swirling like living things. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface smooth and reflective. On the pedestal rested a device. It was small, no larger than a shoebox, and its surface glowed faintly with the same blue light that filled the room. "What is that?" Gavin whispered, his voice barely audible. Gideon stepped forward cautiously. "The source of all this, maybe." Vivienne followed, her gaze darting around the room. "It's like a command center. But for what?" As they approached the pedestal, the hum grew louder, more insistent, as though the device were reacting to their presence. Gideon reached out to touch it, but Vivienne grabbed his arm. "Wait, what if it's dangerous?" "It probably is," Gideon said, his eyes fixed on the device. "But we didn't come this far to back down now." He placed his hand on the device. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, resonant tone that seemed to shake the very air. The screens around them lit up, displaying a flurry of symbols and images, flashes of faces, places, and events that blurred together in a chaotic swirl. "What's happening?" Gavin shouted, shielding his eyes from the light. The device began to pulse, and a voice filled the room. "You were warned." It was the same mechanical voice they had heard before, but now it was deeper, more commanding. "Who are you?" Gideon demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. The voice responded, emotionless and cold. "We are the architects. The balance has been disrupted. You must restore it." "Restore what?" Vivian shouted. "What balance?" The screens flickered, displaying an image of the train. The passengers were visible, their faces frozen in fear. Above them, shadowy figures loomed, their forms indistinct but menacing. "They have taken what is not theirs," the voice said. "The cycle cannot continue. You must choose." The images shifted again, showing the train hurtling through the storm, its carriages glowing faintly with the same blue light that filled the chamber. "What does that mean?" Gideon demanded. "Choose what?" The device pulsed again, and a new image appeared. The train, but empty. No passengers, no shadows, just a hollow shell moving through the night. "You will understand," the voice said, "but not yet." The light intensified, and the hum returned, louder than ever. Gideon shielded his eyes as the room seemed to collapse inward, the walls folding and twisting until there was nothing but the sound of rushing wind. When Gideon opened his eyes, he was back in the engine room. The faint glow of the controls illuminated the space, and the storm's roar filled the air once more. Vivian and Gavin were beside him, their expressions dazed. "What just happened?" Vivian asked, her voice shaky. Gideon looked around, his mind racing. The pedestal, the chamber, the voice, it was all gone, but the weight of the device's warning still hung heavy in the air. "We were shown something," Gideon said, his tone grim. "A choice we have to make, but we're not ready yet." Gavin sat down heavily, his hands trembling. "This is insane. I didn't sign up for this." "None of us did," Gideon said, placing a hand on Gavin's shoulder. "But we're here now. We have to see it through." Vivian nodded slowly, her fear giving way to determination. "Whatever this is, it's not over." Gideon stared out the engine room window, watching the storm rage on as the train hurtled through the darkness. The shadows were still there, lurking at the edges of his vision, waiting for the moment to strike. "We need answers," he said quietly, "and we're running out of time to find them." Chapter 13, Convergence. The engine room was quieter than it had been, but not in a comforting way. The storm outside raged on, yet inside the train there was a sense of stillness, an unnatural pause that pressed on Gideon, Vivian, and Gavin like an unseen force. Whatever had happened in that glowing chamber lingered with them, its cryptic warning echoing in their minds. Gideon broke the silence. "We've seen pieces of the puzzle, but we're missing the key. The passengers, the notes, the shadows, they're all connected." "But how?" Vivian asked, her frustration clear. "What could possibly explain all this?" Gavin leaned against the wall, his face pale. "Maybe it's not meant to be explained. Maybe we're just trapped in someone's experiment." "Or something's," Gideon said, his jaw tightening. "But experiments have a purpose. Whoever or whatever is behind this wants us to make a choice." "And if we don't?" Vivian asked. "They'll keep escalating," Gideon said grimly, "until there's nothing left to choose." The sound of footsteps in the corridor drew their attention. Vivian and Gavin tensed, but Gideon motioned for them to stay back as he approached the door. The footsteps stopped just outside, and a moment later the door creaked open. Manuel stood there, his expression calm but unreadable. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, stepping inside. "What are you doing here?" Gideon asked, his tone sharp. Manuel shrugged. "You've been running all over the train, asking questions, poking at things best left alone. I figured it was time to see what you're really up to." "And why would that matter to you?" Vivian asked, stepping forward. Manuel met her gaze evenly. "Because I've seen this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Manuel leaned against the doorframe, his hands in his pockets. "Years ago, on a train in Eastern Europe, passengers started disappearing one by one, just like here. No one believed me when I said something was wrong. They thought it was a robbery gone bad, maybe a fugitive picking people off, but it wasn't." "What was it?" Gavin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Manuel hesitated, his expression darkening. "Something ancient, something that feeds on fear and chaos. It doesn't just kill, it takes people, uses them. The ones who vanish aren't gone, not completely." Vivian's face paled. "You're saying the passengers are alive?" "Alive isn't the right word," Manuel said. "Changed, maybe, trapped like we are." Gideon crossed his arms, his skepticism clear. "Why didn't you say this earlier?" Because it doesn't make a difference, Manuel replied. Whatever's happening here, you can't stop it. You can only survive it, if you're lucky. That's not good enough, Gideon said, his tone firm. We're not just going to sit here and wait for this thing to pick us off. Manuel studied him for a moment, then sighed. You're stubborn. That might help. Or it might get you killed. What about the notes? Vivian asked. You've seen this before. Did they leave messages like this? Manuel shook his head. No, that's new, but I've got a feeling it's tied to you. Gideon frowned. Why me? Because you're not like the others, Manuel said. You've been chasing this thing since the moment you stepped on board. It knows that, and it's testing you. Gideon's mind raced. Manuel's story, however cryptic, aligned with the pieces they'd seen so far. The shadows, the disappearances, the messages. Whatever was behind this wasn't just random. It was deliberate. We need to act, Gideon said finally. We can't just wait for the next attack. How? Vivian asked. We don't even know what we're fighting. We don't need to fight it, Gideon said. We need to outsmart it. Every move it's made has been calculated. But it's also left us clues. That means it wants us to figure something out. Manuel smirked faintly. You think you can outsmart it? Good luck with that. Gideon ignored him and turned to Vivian and Gavin. The device in the chamber, it said the answer lies in the light. That wasn't a riddle. It was literal. Whatever's controlling this, whatever's driving the disappearances, is connected to that light. Then we go back, Vivian said, her voice steady. Gavin looked horrified. Back there? Are you serious? Yes, Gideon said. If we don't, we're finished. Manuel stepped aside as the three of them moved toward the door. If you're going back, you'd better hurry, he said. The shadows don't like being kept waiting. Gideon glanced back at him. You coming? Manuel shook his head. I've already played this game once. I'm not about to do it again. Suit yourself, Gideon said, stepping into the corridor. The storm outside seemed louder now, the wind howling like a warning. As they made their way back toward the engine room, the train jolted violently, throwing them against the walls. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to shift, crawling along the edges of their vision. We're running out of time, Gideon said, picking up the pace. When they reached the engine room, the door was ajar. Inside, the blue light was pulsing again, brighter and faster than before. Vivian hesitated at the threshold. This feels worse than last time. It is, Gideon said, but it's our only chance. They stepped inside and the light enveloped them once more. Chapter 14, Into the Core. The blue light swallowed them whole, its pulsing rhythm thundering in Gideon's chest like a second heartbeat. The air felt heavier this time, the hum deeper and more resonant. As the light dimmed, they found themselves back in the metallic corridor, but now it was different. The walls, once smooth and featureless, were lined with intricate symbols that glowed faintly. The hum seemed to originate from the very structure around them, as if the train itself were alive. What is this place? Vivian whispered, her voice shaky. Gideon scanned the corridor, his eyes narrowing. A system. A machine. Maybe both. Gavin pressed himself against the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. This isn't right. We shouldn't be here. No, Gideon said, his voice firm. This is exactly where we need to be. Ahead, the corridor opened into a vast chamber, its size impossible to reconcile with the dimensions of the train. The ceiling stretched high above them, lost in shadows, while the floor was a mosaic of glowing tiles that pulsed in time with the hum. At the center of the chamber was a massive column of light, its surface swirling with colors that shifted and flowed like liquid. Vivian stared at it, awe and fear mingling on her face. Is that it? Gideon nodded slowly. The core. Whatever's controlling this train, it's in there. Gavin shook his head, backing away. We shouldn't go near it. This isn't natural. It's not meant for us. We don't have a choice, Gideon said, stepping forward. Whatever this is, it's been pulling the strings from the start. The disappearances, the shadows, the notes, it all leads back to this. As they approached the column, the hum grew louder, vibrating through their bones. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift, rearranging themselves into patterns Gideon couldn't decipher. Vivian stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on the base of the column. Look! There, on a platform encircling the column, were the passengers who had disappeared. Edward Lane, Karen from Cabin 12, and others Gideon hadn't seen vanish but recognized from the train. They stood motionless, their faces blank, their eyes glowing faintly blue. "They're alive," Vivian said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or something close to it," Gideon said grimly. One of the passengers, the woman in the tailored suit, stepped forward, her movements unnaturally fluid. She turned to face them, her glowing eyes locking onto Gideon. "You should not be here," she said, her voice flat and mechanical. "We're not leaving," Gideon said. "Not until we get answers." The woman tilted her head as if considering his words. "You were warned. The cycle cannot be broken." "What cycle?" Gideon demanded. "What does any of this mean?" The woman stepped closer, her glowing eyes piercing. "The balance must be maintained. Those who disrupt it must be corrected." "Corrected?" Vivian said, her voice rising. "You mean killed?" "They are not dead," the woman said. "They are realigned." Gideon clenched his fists. "Realigned to what? What are you trying to achieve?" The column of light pulsed, and the woman stopped. Her expressionless face turned toward the core, as if listening to something only she could hear. "The choice is yours," she said, finally. "Restore the balance, or lose everything." The floor beneath them began to tremble, the pulsing light intensifying. Gideon turned to Vivian and Gavin, his mind racing. "This is it," he said. "This is the choice." "What choice?" Vivian asked, panic creeping into her voice. "Restore the balance," Gideon said. "Let it take control and end the disruptions, or we fight it and risk everything." The hum grew louder, drowning out their voices. The column of light flared, casting the room in blinding brightness. "What do we do?" Gavin shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Gideon looked back at the motionless passengers, their glowing eyes empty yet somehow pleading. He thought of the notes, the cryptic warnings, the escalating tension, and then he made his decision. Chapter 15. The Decision. The blinding light surged, bathing the chamber in waves of energy that pulsed in time with the deafening hum. Gideon's mind raced, the weight of the choice pressing down on him like the storm outside the train. Vivian and Gavin stood frozen beside him, their faces pale with fear and uncertainty. Gideon's voice cut through the chaos, firm and steady. "It's not balance they want, it's control. If we give in, we lose ourselves." Vivian gripped his arm. "And if we fight, we might lose everything. Are you sure about this?" "No," Gideon admitted, his jaw tightening. "But I've been around long enough to know when someone's trying to pull the strings. This isn't realignment, it's erasure." The glowing woman stepped forward, her movements smooth and mechanical. "You misunderstand. Resistance will only accelerate the collapse. Choose to restore balance or face oblivion." Gavin trembled, his eyes darting between Gideon and the column of light. "We can't fight something like this. Look at them." He gestured to the glowing passengers. "Do you want to end up like them?" "We won't," Gideon said. "If we fight, we have a chance. If we give in, we're just pawns in whatever game this is." The column of light flared again, the room trembling with its intensity. The glowing passengers raised their hands in unison, their movements unnervingly synchronized. The woman's voice rang out, cold and emotionless. "Final warning. The cycle must not be broken." Gideon stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You keep talking about cycles and balance, but you're just hiding behind words. Whatever you are, you've been manipulating us from the start. We're not playing your game anymore." He turned to Vivian and Gavin. "Find the device. If we can shut it down, maybe we can stop this." Vivian nodded, her fear replaced by determination. She scanned the chamber, her sharp eyes searching for anything that might disrupt the glowing core. Gavin hesitated, but eventually followed her, his steps unsteady. The glowing woman raised her hand, and the passengers around the column began to move, their mechanical steps echoing in the chamber. "They're coming," Vivian said, her voice tight. "Keep going." Gideon barked, stepping between them and the advancing figures. The passengers moved as one, their blank faces expressionless but focused. Gideon braced himself, his military instincts kicking in. As the first figure reached him, he swung his flashlight, the impact sending the man staggering back. But there was no cry of pain, no reaction, just a cold, mechanical persistence. "Gideon!" Vivian shouted. "Over here!" He turned to see her and Gavin near a panel on the far wall, its surface glowing faintly with the same blue light as the column. Symbols danced across the screen, shifting and rearranging themselves. "This has to be it," Vivian said, her fingers hovering over the controls. "But I don't know how to shut it down." Figure it out, Gideon said, his voice strained as he fought off another advancing passenger. Gavin stepped forward, his hands shaking. Wait, let me try. I've worked with systems like this, basic programming, not whatever this is, but maybe. The glowing woman raised her other hand, and the light in the room dimmed, the hum dropping to a deep, resonant tone that shook the walls. Intervention will result in termination, she said, her voice colder than ever. Then stop us, Gideon growled, his voice defiant. The glowing passengers surged forward, their movements faster now, more aggressive. Gideon fought them off as best he could, but their sheer numbers began to overwhelm him. Behind him, Vivienne and Gavin worked frantically at the panel, the screen flashing with unfamiliar symbols. I think I've got it, Gavin shouted. One more command. A sudden surge of light engulfed the room, blinding them all. The hum rose to a deafening pitch, and for a moment it felt as though the entire train was about to tear itself apart. And then, silence. When Gideon opened his eyes, he was back in the lounge car. The train was still, the storm outside reduced to a faint drizzle. Vivienne and Gavin sat slumped in the seats beside him, their faces dazed but alive. The passengers were back in their places, chatting quietly as though nothing had happened. The glowing woman, the column of light, the metallic chamber, it was all gone. What just happened? Vivienne whispered, her voice shaky. I don't know, Gideon admitted, his chest heaving. But we're still here. Gavin stared out the window, his expression distant. Did we win? Gideon didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the table in front of him, where a single note lay, its words stark and final. The cycle is broken, for now. The train jolted gently, beginning its journey southward once more. But Gideon knew this wasn't over. Whatever had happened, whatever they had disrupted, was only the beginning. And as the train hurtled into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was yet to come.